Chris, what a treat for you after your half-term break to return to, 340 emails, 56 separate WhatsApp conversations, 15 letters and notes of 26 meetings.
Yeah, it's just my inbox.
Yeah, as I was reading that, I was like, oh yeah, I bet you've probably actually got more unread emails.
I thought you were about to say the treat that you'd come down to see us, which
that
of course
too,
it is. Of course it is.
And Joe Pike is here as well. Hello,
Even
Joe.
better.
Hi.
Anyway, this tranche of documents I'm referring to is not Chris Mason's holiday inbox. It is the latest response by the government to the so-called humble address from Parliament, where, prompted by the Tories, they've had to release all the details and correspondence, although not all, about Lord Mandelson's time as the ambassador in Washington. So we had the first lot. This is the second lot.
Yeah.
And it's big.
It is big. In fact, earlier on, the Cabinet Office, the kind of central government department that was charged with sort of pulling all of this together and was responsible for its publication, they were wandering round with all of these documents in a rucksack, because I was looking for, in order to kind of illustrate on the television the kind of scale of this, because a big part of this is the scale of it. Biggest government sort of document drop since the publication of the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq war. So I wanted to illustrate that. So I was saying to me, government, are they going to be like printouts? And I'm like, it's a lot of trees and all that. But they said, we've got one copy, 3 volumes, and we'll send someone to the broadcast building opposite Parliament where we are doing Newscast from today. And you can't keep them, but we'll come in and you can do some filming with them. Anyway, this guy comes in with this rucksack.
Stunt copies of
and I said, can I feel your rucksack? And it was proper weighty. The three documents.
The volumes.
Yeah.
Okay.
1,500 pages.
So, Joe, last night, on Sunday night, you were sending out emails to us all going, okay, I've got it on good authority. This dump of documents is coming today. Because actually, or it was then tomorrow when you were sending the email, but today now. And some people might be listening to this on Tuesday. But we weren't sure exactly when this was going to happen, were we? But we knew it was sort of imminent.
We knew it was sort of imminent. There was pressure because of the humble address process, this parliamentary process, which forced release of these documents. The government had to get it done as soon as they could. But it has been a long, complex process. They spent over £1 million on it. Thousands of civil servant hours have been spent on obtaining, compiling, redacting these documents. And then yesterday, I'm told various people who are mentioned or whose messages are in these documents got a bit of forewarning. It's coming tomorrow. It's coming tomorrow afternoon because it had to be laid in Parliament, and a senior cabinet minister in Darren Jones had to respond and explain the thinking around what they'd included, what they'd not included, and what it says about the operation of government.
And also, there's some caveats to what we've got today. This is not every email in complete detail as was sent at the time. There's some important exceptions.
Yeah, so firstly, someone was pointing out to me that the reality of what we see in these documents is those MPs who had not turned on disappearing messages in WhatsApp and those who had, because if you haven't, then it's quite likely then those emails, those WhatsApps are floating around in these documents. If you turned on disappearing messages, then they're not. In addition to that, there is material in here that you might expect to find that isn't there, principally because of the ongoing police investigation that Lord Mandelson is involved in. He denies any wrongdoing. And so, for instance, you'll recall on previous episodes of Newscast, we've kicked around all of the arguments around the vetting process that went on around Lord Mandelson's appointment, and what questions were asked and what documents were kept and who said what to whom and who didn't say what to whom, etc., etc. When you look at this set of documents, as vast as they are, we don't really learn a great deal about all of that. And our understanding is the reason for that is because of the ongoing police inquiry.
Also, we talk about WhatsApps. There's a big chunk of WhatsApps that are not in here, and these are the ones that are on Peter Mandelson's personal phone, because in the forewords to the documents today, the Cabinet Office has written, oh yeah, we asked Peter Mandelson via his solicitors to provide his WhatsApps that were on his personal phone, and his solicitor said no. Yeah,
and I can tell you that the view from Lord Mandelson is that the reason for that is that the legal advice he received is that nothing should be seen to cut across the police investigation, and therefore that shouldn't be handed over. The point that was also made to me is that the vast majority of his communications during the job were done on the work phone that he has since obviously lost because he's no longer doing the job. But yeah, what messages may have been on that device that we have not seen is an interesting question.
My main takeaway from reading it, or skimming, because I've not read it in minute detail. I skimmed
That
through
would
the
have been
whole
impossible.
thing. But yeah, exactly. That would be like, you know, that scene from Short Circuit, Johnny Five, when he reads all the robot who reads all the books very quickly. It's a classic 80s film. Anyway, is that the government kind of comes out of it unscathed in the sense of there's nothing embarrassing in there about what the British government or ministers or officials really think about Donald Trump.
Well, that is the other thing that's missing.
Redactions.
Where is
Yeah.
everything about Donald Trump? We're
Yeah.
talking about the man who was.
Well, that's why
basically
they've emerged unscathed on that account.
For some of the people that Peter Mandelson would have been communicating with will have been people who are deleting messages. But so many of his conversations were about Donald Trump or the policy around Donald Trump. There's one point where he talks to Matthew Doyle, who used to be the number 10 director of communications, and says, "Oh, I'm worried about Chagos, the Chagos Islands, and policy around that and security. There's been this big fallout in relations between London and Washington over that more recently." And after he says to Matthew Doyle, "I have worries about Chagos Islands," there are asterisks. Not anymore those big black bits of highlighter. It's just asterisks because there are pages and pages of redactions. All of his emails and letters seemingly to the Defence Secretary, or a lot of them, which of course would contain things with national security elements to them, those are redacted. Things to Rachel Reeves about the state of the economy and trade deals, those are redacted too. And I'm sure amongst them there must be some waspish interactions between different people, because privately we know so many people in government do have a slightly different view of Donald Trump than they articulate on the airwaves.
But we shouldn't be that surprised by all of that, because the argument that was always made in the process, and you get a sense with the scale of this, that the industry that this has created within government at considerable expense, as Joe was mentioning, trawling through all of this, compiling all of this, working out what can be legitimately redacted. And one of the arguments that was always made was that on kind of national security and international relations lines, in other words, a polite way of putting, a relationship with Donald Trump needs to continue beyond the publication of these documents, that there would be some redactions going on. It's rather easier, or rather harder, I should say, to illustrate visually the blanking out when there isn't page after page of
Tricky,
black
isn't it?
ink somehow, compared with asterisks. Asterisks don't seem as definitive as black ink, even though the consequence is exactly the same, which is that, we're not seeing what was really said on a lot of all of this stuff. One of the just additional point to quickly make on all of this, whenever I speak to folk who have worked either in the embassy in Washington or in the Foreign Office or the Ministry of Defence, they always come back to the point that the real meaning of the quote-unquote special relationship is not the ongoing relationship between an existing Prime Minister or President. It's the depth of the security and defence relationship. In other words, right into all of that space, whether it currently is about the Chagos Islands and Diego Garcia, or about defence spending, or about intelligence. There's a vast amount of traffic that goes back the whole time on those issues, which I think most reasonable observers would acknowledge is probably in the UK's best interest, does get redacted, even when you have Parliament demanding that as much as is conceivable should see the light of day.
Kind of the juiciest stuff that's not redacted is WhatsApp messages with current government ministers. And I notice a lot of the newspapers are writing up the conversations with Pat McFadden, who's currently the Work and Pensions Secretary, was on Laura's programme on Sunday talking about youth unemployment. But for a lot of this period was the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, so basically one of the senior ministers in the Cabinet Office, right at the centre of government, coordinating lots of things. And he and Peter Mandelson go a long way back, don't they? Because, of course, Pat McFadden was political secretary to Tony Blair in the noughties, so they clearly have known each other for a long time. Joe, just give us a flavour of their exchanges. And it is a flavour because it's quite a lot of exchanges.
A lot of exchanges. I'm sure Pat McFadden will be regretting not having disappearing messages on his WhatsApps. Although we should point out, and Darren Jones nodded to this in the Commons today, is disappearing messages a good thing for transparency in government and for decision making in government? A lot of people have got out of being held to account for their communications because of that. I'm not sure we should paint Pat McFadden as being silly for not doing what some of his colleagues have done.
Or necessarily, even though there's definitely politics that we can unpick, and there's a longevity to the politics around the particular quote that I think Joe has at his fingertips that Pat McFadden tapped out in a message to Peter Mandelson. There's also a consistency, if you like, to what we hear from Pat McFadden, in that he has He later goes on to become the Work and Pensions Secretary with an attempt to try and deliver the very thing the government failed to deliver in its first year, which was significant reform of the benefit system. And he's gone in to do that job because of a sense that Labour MPs needed persuading of the merits of what he argues for, and they were not convinced about. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself here because I guess you should read the key quote.
The key quote is that he was describing conversations he'd had with other Labour politicians, with Labour MPs, about the welfare system and public spending. And he said, every meeting I have is, quote, who can we tax in order to pay benefits to others? They're asking the wrong questions, he said to Peter Mandelson. And I think that is something that opposition parties are going to leap on. Certainly Keir Starmer of the Tories has, saying that McFadden has said in private what he and the Prime Minister deny in public. Labour is now, quote, the welfare party. We should point out McFadden's team have responded, including saying that publicly, he said many times, the question we should ask is not what you are entitled to, but how can we change your life?
Yeah, I mean, effectively, he can argue, and I think with some legitimacy, that what he was articulating privately is broadly consistent with what he said publicly and the argument that he's been trying to make to Labour MPs. However, politically, because politics can be pretty cruel around these sort of things, it has a slight comparator. I think this comparison that I'm about to offer is arguably a little bit overdone, but I'll make it anyway. There's a slight comparison, I think, with that Liam Byrne remark from way back in 2010 of that note that he sent that he thought was going to be read by Philip Hammond.
The famous "There's no money left."
Exactly. The note "There's no money left," which was meant as a private gag because he assumed, I think I'm right in remembering that he thought he could guess who was likely to be his successor after the 2010 election, and then because of the coalition, it wasn't the same person, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, there's a slight sort of... It's one of those lines that opponents can forever quote back at you because of that sense that it gets to an essential truth that you were willing to articulate privately that you'd have said rather more diplomatically publicly, even if, broadly speaking, it's getting at something that they can argue is consistent with what they believe.
And also when they're WhatsApping each other at all times of day and also arranging to have breakfast and bacon sandwiches together and whatever, Pat McFadden and Peter Mandelson are in agreement sometimes that the number 10 operation isn't working very well at that point in time.
And there's several riffs, aren't there, from Peter Mandelson along exactly that line from last summer, broadly speaking.
And they all really come in the McFadden-Mandelson conversations. The number 10 operation is, Mandelson says, quotes, beleaguered and bereft. They don't work as a team. They are not led, and none of them really knows what Keir thinks or wants. In fact, most of them don't think Keir knows what he wants. The other thing that Mandelson claims Morgan McSweeney, who was the Chief of Staff, thought at the time was that the Prime Minister's instincts were sort of weak and that he was always on a cycle of, quote, advance, buckle, advance, buckle. Now, as you'd expect, we've approached Morgan McSweeney for comment on that. We've not had a response yet. But these private criticisms of the PM are pretty constant.
I just think this is an interesting kind of reflection on kind of modern communications in the mid-2020s. The whole disappearing messages question. And the argument that you can have that you were setting out, as Darren Jones had made, around, you know, the legitimacy or otherwise of turning on disappearing messages versus the extent to which, in reality now, a lot of WhatsApp exchanges are a written down substitute for snatched verbal contemporaneous conversation with all of the caveats that you would attach to a chat in a corridor with a colleague if the equivalent was happening, which might be a bit snatched, a bit off the top of your head, a bit blunt, but intended to be utterly ephemeral. And of course, the reality of messages that aren't disappearing is that they're not ephemeral, that they sit there in all sorts of contexts. And we see this playing out in public life all the time. I think there's a story today, isn't there, involving the Southampton manager and the whole business of Spygate and all of that on WhatsApp messages, where something that in a previous era, because of the instantaneous nature of it, not even email's comparable, is it? Because they tend to be a bit more sort of, you send it and then you get a reply, 2 days later or whatever, or never, in my experience. What is, that question around the legitimacy of the rise of disappearing messages? One for newscasters to ponder.
Somebody who is scrupulously boring in their WhatsApp messages to Peter Mandelson is Keir Starmer. because there's a page of messages between the two of them just after the election, actually. So not sort of when Mandelson was a government employee much later.
iMessages as well. Who's using iMessage?
Is it iMessage?
Yeah, that's what it says at the top of that page.
All right. So like when your grandma texts you, yeah. And iMessage, of course, used by people of all ages. I just find iMessages feels more formal these days on your phone than sending a WhatsApp.
And they were talking.
Yeah.
Anyway, enough phone-esque. But basically, my takeaway from that page of messages from Starmer to Mandelson was it was almost like Mandelson was interacting with a highly realistic Keir Starmer chatbot. Because everything Keir Starmer says is very on message, very careful, and full of things like, "Oh, I'm just pleased that I'm not in opposition anymore because you can get more done in government."
Which is exactly what he so often
Exactly,
said,
no,
has said
exactly.
publicly. I mean, maybe to that extent, a sort of instant message, whether WhatsApp or iMessage, or no doubt others are available too, are actually kind of, in their own way, revealing of character. That you know, when you hear some of Lord Mandelson's contributions, you get a sense of authentic Lord Mandelson, and maybe in those iMessages from the Prime Minister, as you say, you're getting an element of that, an element of him being fastidious, but also, as his critics might see it, very cautious.
Or maybe chatting to somebody he doesn't actually know that well personally.
So he's perhaps a bit more reserved.
Isn't that central to the sort of strangeness of this scenario? Maybe there isn't something that's hugely damaging in these documents to Keir Starmer directly, but we're talking about it because he made what he admits is a pretty catastrophic decision to appoint Lord Mandelson as the US ambassador. That's because of the links to Jeffrey Epstein, but also he's appointed somebody who is criticising him relentlessly behind his back throughout this process. That is another thing that we've learned. OK, this doesn't necessarily show that Keir Starmer has sent something of that tone, but he has appointed somebody who he presumably doesn't realise is spending a lot of his time saying, what a mess of an operation.
But then I guess the counter-argument would be, if you're Lord Mandelson, is that you've been hired because you are political to your fingertips. You've been hired because you're going into a particular circumstance in Washington with the return of Donald Trump and all the rest of it. And that he's seeking privately to, steer the government into a better place.
And is there an argument, looking at how he's interacted with so many different people at different levels, that this is somebody, for all of his well-publicised faults, who is an operator, who did have relationships across government, and from the frequency of these messages was clearly working very hard to try and get something done? And I'm sure he'd argue some of the works around maybe trade deals or tech deals or visits of top politicians is evidence for that.
The other thing, just sort of taking a bit of a step back on this, that I always think with every kind of news story, there's a kind of arc, isn't there? And a story will reach a crescendo and then it'll have a sort of downward arc. And I think on this today, there's two downward arcs. We're on the downward arc of two things. One is, even though the volume of this is far greater than that first drop, what was it, 147 pages was it last time, something like that, and this time it's sort of put a naught on the end of that. Since then, we've had that first drop, then we've had Morgan McSweeney in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Then we've had the sacking of Ollie Robbins and him appearing in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee. In other words, the Lord Mandelson story we have had quite a lot of. And then you get this latest tranche, whatever the correct pronunciation of that word is. Maybe we won't have to use that word ever again, which is probably no bad thing. And then the other arc is the arc of the Keir Starmer story, which is, we're looking at all this stuff about, the critique of Keir Starmer's leadership and all the rest of it. But the context is one where we've just been through the last month and there's basically a leadership race underway to replace him. And so we're seeing all of this in the, where in a different context the ... would be, and where does this leave Keir Starmer? Well, we kind of, whatever the longevity or otherwise of Keir Starmer's remaining time in Downing Street, we kind of know where he is politically. And so the capacity of any event, including this, to fundamentally change that is probably just limited by circumstance.
And in terms of ending different narratives, one thing I have found fascinating is the fact that there are people in government in sort of communications roles who seemingly want to help us find certain things in these documents to ensure what happens today doesn't drip out until tomorrow and later in the week. Now, to be clear, people in government have not been pointing us to that Pat McFadden quote, or indeed
we read that with our own eyes,
or indeed Peter Mandelson's many criticisms of their top boss. But what they have been keen to do is point to different page numbers. Have you seen this? Have you seen that?
Oh, yeah,
Wanting to ensure that we get
really?
everything. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Everything
somebody
today. So
texted me.
it doesn't happen tomorrow, next week, and it
Okay.
doesn't
Somebody
day after day, which is more
texted me
damaging.
3 hours before it came, saying keep an eye on page 155 of Volume 1.
Right.
You know?
And what was
What's
that?
And what that was the thing that they were also keen to point to when the documents did eventually drop, which was the handwritten letter from Lord Mandelson to David Lammy, the then Foreign Secretary, which was basically tilting for the job. This was before the process of finding a new ambassador. It was the handwritten letter, which signed off words to the effect of, I don't have the verbatim quote in front of me, but you won't regret it.
That's basically what it said, yeah.
If you give me the job.
And also, we should just say that in this cache of documents, it is basically just a colour photocopy of this handwritten note on House of Lords notepaper
and it
from
is
Lord Mandelson.
Yeah,
in his handwriting.
and it is literally a splash of colour in what is otherwise black and white sort of typed text, because it is a handwritten with a blue pen, I think. It's a handwritten pitch for the job. Now, it's colour because, people can pitch for jobs, and he was clearly keen on the job because he wanted the job and he got the job. So in that sense, there's no kind of revelation. But it was interesting that they were seeking to point to that. And as Joe says, I think because there's an element of, I'm always up for people being sort of vaguely helpful when big good documents drop, but they will do that for their own reason.
Absolutely.
And their own reason is to point towards things that they'd quite like there to be a focus on. But also in this context, as Joe says, to manage the news of this, because obviously with documents of this scale, from their perspective, oh my goodness, it's Monday, fine, but there's going to be people finding stuff on page 493 of Volume 2 a week on Wednesday or whatever, and that's kind of inevitable. But they would obviously in time rather talk about anything else.
Talking of splashes of colour, the debacle over the red box.
Yeah, that was
Did you see this? So
fascinating.
this is this idea that somebody has a brainwave somewhere, and I can't remember whose idea it is, and maybe it's not clear whose idea it is, that President Trump would love a red ministerial box.
It would mean the most to the president.
Yeah, with the King's cipher on it, and then the President of the United States embossed on it, so he could look like he was Transport Secretary in the UK or whatever.
Why would he know about that? How is Donald Trump going to understand?
Well, they're quite iconic, though, aren't they?
Are they to a US president? Somebody is he that interested in the sort of minutiae of UK politics? Ollie Robbins did say, though, one of the gifts that would mean the most to the president would be a red dispatch box with the gold crest and lettering mimicking a UK government ministerial box inscribed upon it. And Mandelson, quote, went tonto and said the saga over getting this went on for far too long. It's like something out of the thick of it.
So he clearly thought this was all a bit bonkers and had taken up far too much time. And it does make you think.
No. I think what he was annoyed about was that it had taken too long to get the red box made.
Right.
Oh, he was frustrated by that.
I think he was happy for it to be there to be many emails about the red box.
Sure, but
he was chasing it up.
right.
Yeah.
But then there is that point, isn't there, that you do wonder if the president thought, oh yeah, this is just like the thing the DEFRA secretary walks around with, or whatever. However, of course, you put yourself in their shoes, and I was on the part of the reporter pack that went with the Prime Minister when he went out to the White House to meet Donald Trump in office for the first time, and the sheer jeopardy that hung around that was huge. And you're thinking, as they always are, a Prime Minister and a President, but particularly with a President of the character of this one, how do you kind of win that moment? How do you try and win him over? What do you give as gifts? And you'll recall, nerdy newscasters will recall the history that is connected to the kind of exchange of gifts, and they remember the whole story about President Obama giving Gordon Brown a load of DVDs that wouldn't work in a UK DVD.
Oh yeah, and don't worry,
player.
I wasn't saying that I wasn't alleging that it was a bad idea.
No, sure, but
but
it's just an interesting insight, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just interesting that the might of the British state seeking to flatter Donald Trump can't get a red box made in time for the visit, because it then ended up not being handed over.
And remember that the big coup was the bell from the HMS Trump. Some old bell from an old
They must have
ship no
spent
one's ever
years
heard of.
trying to find that down on this track record.
Don't need to spend too much.
Another thing that it sort of chimed for me a bit, to use a Bell reference, is at the start when there's loads and loads of emails about the vetting and the security clearance and what the difference between that is and the due diligence report, which was the Cabinet Office, and we've gone over that in a lot of detail in previous episodes. But there's a bit where a very presumably junior person in the vetting team emails Lord Mandelson with some follow-up stuff saying, oh, can you just update and complete the list of foreign nationals you've been in contact with?
Yeah.
And Mandelson then sends that on to another official saying, what on earth does this mean? Every single person I've ever met, ministers, ex-ministers, whatsoever. And then somebody else then sees this discussion and chips into it going, he knows everybody. And actually, that's quite an illuminating little thing about why the system struggled to sort of kind of categorize him or deal with him appropriately or find the right sort of set of approvals for somebody who'd lived such a big, international, complicated life.
Yeah, and I just think as well, if we step away from the kind of headlines of this, so often for us, reporting on government, the very nature of the connections and relationships that political journalists tend to emphasise, because it's those who are politically most important, is a relatively thin veneer and temporary veneer on top of the government machine. And of course you try and develop contacts within the civil service and all the rest of it, but for perfectly good reason, a lot of those people in those roles are reluctant to engage with journalists. And this gives you a snapshot of those processes, doesn't it? And those structures. And then in this instance, as you say, Adam, them wrestling with a very atypical appointment to such a marquee diplomatic role, and the kind of challenges and the stresses and strains that puts on the system.
I also feel a bit sorry for Karen Pierce, who was the previous inhabitant of the embassy in Washington, because there's a couple of messages from her that sort of give off a little whiff of FOMO. I have no idea if she had FOMO or not, but there's
I think
one.
she'd like to have stayed on.
Yeah, that's what I sort of got from the messages. And there's one where she's, because the garden won a prize, the embassy garden won a prize or something like that, and she's replying to Peter Mandelson saying congratulations on the prize for the garden. And I thought maybe I was reading in a bit of wistfulness there, but I think some of her allies would say yes, she was wistful,
and also she had
it's a nice garden as well. I've had a glass of orange
humble
squash
brag. Oh, at least
the
there's a
whole
soft drink.
orange squash. Yeah, right.
in that garden.
She had, though, put in a lot of time to build relationships with Team Trump, and I think there was some.
And she's very courteous and friendly to them, obviously.
Yeah,
Yes,
but there were certainly people close to her who were frustrated that those skills weren't really put to use, even though Lord Mandelson seemingly had some pretty good relationships with Trump allies too.
And Chris, just end on what we think Lord Mandelson thinks about all of this, because we haven't seen him in public. Well, he's been seen in public, but hasn't said anything on the record about this.
Yeah, so he has certainly been frustrated at some of the reporting in the building up to this. You might have seen the Guardian stories around the concerns within the bowels of Westminster that the Guardian has reported on, claiming there were concerns around security relating to some of Lord Mandelson's connections in China, in Russia, in Israel, and there's certainly a frustration, I think, from Lord Mandelson about what he sees as a kind of confusion there, either a confusion within the system or a confusion in how it was briefed to the Guardian. As I said, I don't think we're any the wiser really about a lot of all of that because of what isn't in all of these documents. I mean, I think from the government's perspective, they'll be glad they've got through this. They knew this was coming. This has been hanging over them now for months. Of course, it's not quite the end of it because there's the ongoing police investigation, and whatever comes out of that, and obviously that's for the police to decide. There could then still be, I guess, the potential that some things that are currently not seeing the light of day because of that may eventually see the light of day. And I think the bigger picture point is that, however long or short the remaining tenure of the Prime Minister in Downing Street, as he has publicly acknowledged, that the decision to send Lord Mandelson to Washington will be up there in the critiques that others, and indeed he, will offer of his time as Prime Minister, and be a fairly central pillar of that critique. And we've heard the Prime Minister. It'll pain him, yeah, and we've heard him very candidly and publicly acknowledge that this is this thing that throughout the close on 2 years now that he's been in office has certainly in the second year of that has been back and back again and again and again.
And in terms of the criminal investigation, Lord Mandelson has repeatedly let it be known that he believes he's not acted criminally, did not act for personal gain, and he says he is cooperating with the police. Right, Chris, good to catch up.
Ta.
Joe, good to see you too.
Lovely to see you too, Adam.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast, apart from to say the last few episodes I've been saying, go to the Edinburgh Fringe website and you can get tickets for the Newscast shows at the Edinburgh Fringe in the week of the 10th of August. They've all sold out, which is an amazing tribute to how enthusiastic some of you are about coming to see us, which is great. Don't worry, though, if you haven't got a ticket, because we were putting all the episodes in the Newscast feed so that you can be part of it. And I'll think of ways that we can include you too, even if you haven't been able to get a ticket to Edinburgh. And maybe next year we'll book Murrayfield Stadium.
Let's do it.
And then we won't be able to sell that out and it'll be really embarrassing. Anyway, and of course, Chris and Joe, there is a seat for you on the stage any of the days that we're there if you can fit it into your travel plans.
Hurrah.
Right, bye-bye.